The studio buzzed with anticipation as Stephen Colbert, sharp-witted and impeccably suited, strode onto the set of his late-night talk show. His signature grin masked a flicker of unease. Tonight's guest was Elon Musk, the tech titan whose every word seemed to spark headlines or havoc. The audience, a mix of loyal fans and curious onlookers, sensed something electric in the air. Why had Musk agreed to this interview? Was he here to charm, provoke, or unveil some grand vision? Colbert, known for his incisive humor, had a reputation for disarming even the most formidable guests. But Musk, with his unpredictable candor, was no ordinary adversary. Could Colbert keep control, or was this a collision waiting to happen? The show began with Colbert's monologue, a razor-sharp dissection of recent events. He skewered politicians and corporations alike, but one joke landed differently. "So folks, artificial intelligence is taking over, but don't worry, it's only as smart as the guy programming it," he quipped, pausing for laughter. "Which, if it's a certain tech mogul, means it's probably tweeting memes at 3 in the morning. The crowd roared, but the jab at Musk's public persona set a subtle tone. Backstage, Musk watched from a monitor, his expression unreadable. Was he amused, or was that a glint of defiance in his eyes? As Musk took the stage, the applause was thunderous but tinged with curiosity. He wore a simple black jacket, his demeanor relaxed, yet commanding. Colbert greeted him warmly, but the handshake lingered a beat too long, as if each man was sizing up the other. The opening banter was light, touching on Musk's latest ventures. "You're building rockets, cars, and now brain chips," Colbert said, leaning forward. "What's next, Elon? A time machine to fix your old tweets?" The audience laughed, but Musk's smile tightened. "I'd rather build something that makes people think than edit the past, Stephen," he replied, his tone polite but pointed. The conversation soon veered into treacherous territory, the role of technology in society. Colbert, sensing an opportunity, pressed Musk on the growing influence of artificial intelligence. "Look, Elon, you're pushing AI faster than anyone. But people are scared. Jobs are at stake, privacy's a mess. Aren't you just handing corporations a loaded gun?" The question was laced with accusation, and the audience leaned in. Musk's jaw clenched, but he answered evenly. "AI's a tool, Stephen. Here it's not the problem, it's how we use it. Fear's just ignorance in a fancy suit." The retort drew scattered cheers, but Colbert wasn't done. The host pivoted to a hotter topic: Musk's vocal stance on free speech and his recent clashes with regulators over online content. "You've been pretty loud about censorship, but isn't your platform just amplifying chaos?" Colbert asked, his tone sharpening. "Some say you're less a free speech hero and more a guy who likes to stir the pot." The accusation hung in the air. Why was Colbert pushing so hard? Was he baiting Musk, or did he genuinely believe the tech mogul was reckless? The audience held its breath, sensing the first sparks of conflict. Musk leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Chaos, Stephen? Or truth people don't want to hear? You tell me what's more dangerous." The tension was palpable now, a live wire running through the studio. Colbert, perhaps sensing he'd struck a nerve, doubled down. "Truth's great, but when it's mixed with conspiracy theories and bad faith, it's a problem. You're not just a bystander, Elon. You're the one turning up the volume." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. Musk's face hardened, and for a moment silence reigned. Then he spoke, his voice low but cutting. "You know what's loud, Stephen? Hypocrisy. You sit here preaching while your network edits reality every night." The audience gasped. The gauntlet had been thrown. Colbert's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, steering the conversation toward a commercial break. As the cameras cut, the studio hummed with whispers. What had just happened? Had Musk crossed a line, or was Colbert's sanctimonious tone the real provocation? The argument was only beginning, and the night was about to ignite to cool the simmering tension in the studio. As the cameras rolled again, Stephen Colbert leaned back in his chair, his smile now a practiced mask of composure. The audience, still buzzing from Elon Musk's biting retort, waited for the next move in this high-stakes verbal chess match. Musk sat upright, his gaze locked on Colbert, unyielding and intense. The host, determined to regain control, dove back into the fray, but the air had shifted. What had started as a pointed exchange was now a battle of wills, and neither man seemed willing to yield. Colbert opened with a question designed to needle. "Elon, let's talk about responsibility. You've got billions of eyes on your platform, and yet it's a lightning rod for controversy. Don't you think you have a duty to rein in the madness?" His tone was measured, but the implication was clear. Musk was reckless, a puppeteer of digital chaos. The audience leaned forward, sensing the host's intent to corner his guest. But Musk wasn't one to be caged. He tilted his head, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "Duty, Stephen? That's rich coming from a guy who makes a living cherry-picking sound bites for laughs." The jab landed hard, and a ripple of gasps swept through the crowd. Colbert's eyes narrowed, but he pressed on, undeterred. "I'm not the one running a platform where misinformation spreads like wildfire," he shot back. "You talk about truth, but what about the lies? The election, conspiracies, the health scams? You're not just amplifying voices, you're amplifying danger." The accusation was bold, a direct challenge to Musk's ethos. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others bristling at the host's sanctimonious tone. Was Colbert genuinely concerned, or was he playing to the room's progressive leanings? Musk's response was swift and surgical. "You want to talk danger, Stephen? Let's talk about the media's monopoly on narrative. Your show, your network, you decide what's misinformation and what's gospel. That's not truth. That's power." His voice was calm but laced with steel, each word a dart aimed at Colbert's credibility. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and boos, the division palpable. Musk wasn't just defending himself, he was turning the tables, exposing the host's own biases. Colbert's smile tightened, a flicker of unease betraying his polished facade. The host, sensing the audience's split loyalties, shifted tactics. He leaned forward, adopting a more personal tone. "Look, Elon, I get it. You're a disruptor, but when you disrupt, people get hurt. Small businesses lose ads. Communities get torn apart. Don't you ever worry about the human cost?" The question was a trap, cloaked in empathy but designed to paint Musk as callous. The studio grew quiet, waiting for his response. Musk paused, his expression unreadable, then leaned into the microphone. "I worry about humans every day, Stephen. That's why I build things to lift them up. You just tear them down for applause." The audience gasped again, louder this time. Musk's words were a direct assault, accusing Colbert of exploiting division for clout. The host's face flushed, a rare crack in his composure. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. "Tear down? I'm just asking questions, Elon," he said, his voice tinged with defensiveness. But Musk wasn't letting up. "Questions, sure, but they're loaded and you know it. You're not a journalist, Stephen. You're a performer." The crowd roared, some in outrage, others in approval. The studio felt like a powder keg, and Musk had just lit a match. Colbert, now visibly rattled, tried to steer the conversation to safer ground, pivoting to Musk's space ventures. But the damage was done. The audience was no longer watching a talk show. They were witnessing a showdown. Every word, every glance carried weight. Musk's refusal to play the genial guest had thrown Colbert off balance, and the host's attempts to regain footing only deepened the divide. As the segment neared another break, the tension was unbearable. The question wasn't whether the argument would escalate, it was how far it would go. As the show barreled toward its next segment, the studio crackled with raw energy. Stephen Colbert, his composure fraying, adjusted his tie, a nervous tick betraying the pressure. Elon Musk, by contrast, seemed almost serene, his earlier intensity, now a smoldering focus. The audience, split between those cheering Musk's defiance and those loyal to Colbert's wit, hung on every moment. The host had tried to pivot to lighter topics, but Musk's relentless counters had turned the interview into a battlefield. Now, with the cameras rolling again, the confrontation was about to reach a fever pitch. Colbert, determined to reclaim authority, leaned into a new line of attack. "Elon, you're a guy who dreams big, but let's talk about the fallout. Your companies push boundaries, sure, But they also leave people behind. Workers laid off, communities disrupted. How do you sleep at night knowing your vision comes at such a cost? The question was a calculated jab, framed to cast Musk as a heartless capitalist. The audience murmured, some nodding at the host's moral stance, others waiting for Musk's inevitable retort. Was Colbert genuinely holding Musk accountable, or was this just another performance? Musk's eyes flashed with something dangerous. He leaned forward, his voice low but piercing. You want to talk about cost, Stephen? Let's talk about yours. You sit here preaching about workers while your industry thrives on outrage and division. How do you sleep knowing you're part of that machine? The accusation was a gut punch, flipping the script to expose Colbert's role in the media's own disruptions. The crowd erupted, a chaotic mix of cheers and jeers. Musk wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling the host's moral. High ground. Colbert's face tightened, his smile now a grimace. I'm not the one firing thousands to cut costs, he snapped, his tone sharper than before. You talk about building the future, but what about the people you leave in the dust? The host's voice rose, betraying a rare loss of control. The audience sensed blood in the water, their murmurs growing louder. Musk didn't flinch. I build for the future, Stephen, not for your applause, he said, his words dripping with disdain. You want to help people? Stop grandstanding and start creating something real. The studio fell silent for a split second, the weight of Musk's insult landing like a thunderclap. Colbert, visibly stung, tried to pivot, but his rhythm was off. Creating? I create conversations, Elon, that's my job, he said, but the words sounded hollow, defensive. Musk seized the opening, his voice cutting through the tension. Conversations? No, Stephen, you create narratives, you twist, you spin, you sell, and you're mad because I don't play your game. The audience roared, some in shock, others in awe. Musk's words were a public unmasking, and Colbert was reeling. The host, now cornered, made a fateful mistake. You're not above the game, Elon, he said, his voice laced with venom. You're just another billionaire dodging accountability, hiding behind your toys. The insult was crude, a low blow that drew gasps from the crowd. For a moment, it seemed Colbert had landed a hit, but Musk's response was devastating. Toys, Stephen. I build rockets that touch the stars. You build punchlines that die by morning. Tell me, who's really dodging? The crowd exploded, the applause deafening. Musk had turned Colbert's attack into a humiliating mirror, exposing the host's sanctimony. The segment lurched toward a break, but the damage was done. Colbert's polished veneer had cracked, his attempts to outwit Musk backfiring spectacularly. The audience, once divided, now leaned toward Musk's raw honesty, their cheers drowning out the host's forced chuckle. Backstage, producers exchanged frantic glances, sensing the show was slipping from their control. The argument had become a spectacle, and Musk was no longer just a guest. He was a force, dismantling Colbert's carefully curated stage. The night was far from over, but the tide had turned. The studio lights felt harsher now, casting long shadows as Stephen Colbert gripped the edge of his desk. His usual charisma was fraying, replaced by a taut defensiveness that the audience could feel. Elon Musk, seated across from him, exuded a quiet confidence, his earlier barbs having shifted the room's energy in his favor. The crowd, still reeling from Musk's devastating takedown, buzzed with anticipation. Colbert had been outmaneuvered, his moral posturing exposed, and the host was visibly struggling to regain his footing. The next segment began, but the air was thick with the promise of further reckoning. Colbert, desperate to pivot, tried a softer approach, his voice laced with forced camaraderie. All right, Elon, let's lighten things up. You're a guy who's always looking forward. Space, AI, electric cars. What's the one thing you wish people understood about your vision? The question was a lifeline, an attempt to steer the conversation toward neutral ground. But the audience wasn't buying it, their murmurs suggesting they craved more of the raw confrontation. Musk tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Was he willing to play along, or was he poised to strike? Again, Musk's response was deceptively calm. I wish people saw that I'm not here to win popularity contests, Stephen. I'm here to solve problems. The world's messy, and I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty. The words were measured, but the subtext was clear. Unlike Colbert, Musk wasn't chasing applause. The audience leaned in, sensing the dig. Colbert forced a laugh, but his eyes betrayed irritation. Solving problems is great, Elon, but you can't ignore the collateral damage. People aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. The jab was meant to reclaim moral authority, but it fell flat, sounding rehearsed. Musk seized the opening, his voice sharp and unrelenting. Collateral damage, Stephen? You mean like the division you sow every night? You lecture me about people, but you're the one profiting off their anger. The accusation was a blade, cutting through Colbert's attempt at empathy. The crowd gasped, then erupted in cheers, their allegiance shifting further toward Musk. Colbert's face flushed, his composure crumbling. I'm holding a mirror to society, Elon, he snapped. You're the one breaking it. The retort was desperate, and the audience sensed it, their murmurs turning to uneasy whispers. The host's unraveling was now undeniable. Musk leaned forward, his gaze piercing. A mirror? No, Stephen. You're holding a script. You pick your villains. You write your jokes and you call it truth. That's not a mirror, it's a stage. The words were a public indictment, stripping away Colbert's pretense of impartiality. The audience roared, some in shock, others in admiration. Musk had turned the host's own platform against him, exposing the artifice of his righteous persona. Colbert's smile was gone now, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. In a last-ditch effort, Colbert tried to pivot to humor. Well, folks, I guess I'm just a humble comedian, not a rocket scientist, he said, forcing a chuckle. But the joke landed like a lead balloon, the audience's silence deafening. Musk didn't miss a beat. Humble, Stephen? You're about as humble as a network executive picking next season's lineup. The crowd exploded again, the laughter now at Colbert's expense. The host's face burned with humiliation, his attempts to deflect only deepening the wound. He had underestimated Musk's willingness to play dirty, and it was costing him dearly. As the segment neared its close, Colbert's producers signaled frantically from offstage, urging him to wrap up. The host, now visibly shaken, muttered a curt transition to the next guest, but the damage was irreversible. Musk sat back, his expression one of quiet triumph, while the audience's cheers followed him like a wave. Colbert had tried to paint Musk as the villain, but the tech mogul had flipped the narrative, leaving the host exposed and diminished. The night was spiraling, and the final act loomed with the promise of a reckoning. The studio was a cauldron of tension as the next segment began, the audience's energy now a palpable force. Stephen Colbert, his confidence battered, sat rigid behind his desk, his eyes darting between the crowd and his guest. Elon Musk by E. Contrast was a study in composure, his earlier ferocity now a quiet intensity that unnerved the host even more. The crowd, having witnessed Colbert's unraveling, was firmly in Musk's corner, their cheers a constant reminder of the host's faltering grip. The show was no longer a platform for witty banter, it was a crucible, and Colbert was burning. Determined to salvage his dignity, Colbert launched into a new tactic, his voice strained but resolute. Elon, you've made your point about truth and disruption, but let's talk about trust. People don't trust you, your companies, your motives. How do you convince a world that's skeptical of your intentions? The question was a veiled accusation, designed to paint Musk as an untrustworthy opportunist. The audience leaned in, curious but skeptical of Colbert's pivot. Was this a genuine probe or another attempt to claw back control? Musk's response was immediate, his tone icy. Trust, Stephen. That's a funny word coming from you. People don't trust me because I challenge the status quo. They don't trust you because you prop it up. The retort was a sledgehammer, accusing Colbert of complicity in a broken system. The crowd erupted, their applause shaking the studio. Musk's words weren't just a defense. They were an indictment of the entire media machine Colbert represented. The host's jaw tightened, his hands clenching beneath the desk. Colbert, now cornered, let his frustration boil over. You're not some rebel hero, Elon, he snapped, his voice rising. You're a guy who plays fast and loose with rules, and people pay the price. That's not disruption. That's arrogance. The insult was raw, A desperate swing that drew gasps from the audience. For a moment it seemed Colbert had regained some ground, his passion resonating with those still loyal to him. But Musk was unfazed, his eyes glinting with resolve. Arrogance, Stephen. At least I'm not pretending to be the good guy while peddling outrage for ratings. The crowd's reaction was seismic, their cheers and laughter drowning out Colbert's attempt to respond. Musk's words were a surgical strike, exposing the host's sanctimonious facade as a ratings-driven performance. Colbert's face contorted, his composure shattered. "I'm not peddling anything," he stammered, but the words lacked conviction, and the audience's silence was damning. Musk leaned forward, his voice low and lethal. "You're peddling a brand, Stephen. The righteous host, the voice of reason. But it's all an act, and everyone here sees it." The studio was chaos now, the audience's roars a tidal wave of support for Musk. Colbert, humiliated, tried to pivot to a commercial break, his voice barely audible over the din. "We'll be right back, folks," he muttered, but the words were lost in the crowd's fervor. Musk sat back, his expression one of quiet victory, while Colbert's producers scrambled backstage, their faces pale with panic. The host had been stripped bare, his authority obliterated by Musk's relentless truth-telling. The show was teetering on the edge, and the final confrontation loomed. As the cameras cut, the audience's chants of Musk's name echoed through the studio, a humiliating soundtrack to Colbert's defeat. The host stared at his desk, his hands trembling, while Musk rose from his seat, his presence commanding even, in silence. The tech mogul had turned the tables, transforming Colbert's stage into a platform for his own unfiltered voice. The night was nearing its end, but the final act promised a resolution that would leave no one unscathed. The studio was a pressure cooker as the final segment loomed, the audience's fervor now a living entity, pulsing with anticipation. Stephen Colbert, his face a mask of barely contained fury, sat hunched at his desk, the weight of his public, humiliation crushing his usual swagger. Elon Musk, radiating an unshakable calm, seemed almost detached, as if the chaos he'd unleashed was merely a byproduct of his resolve. The crowd, now overwhelmingly behind Musk, vibrated with energy, their earlier division replaced by a unified hunger for the climax of this brutal showdown. The stage was set for a reckoning, and no one doubted it would be unforgettable. Colbert, grasping at the last threads of his authority, opened with a gambit that reeked of desperation. "Elon, you've had a lot to say about truth and responsibility, but let's be real. You're not here to save the world. You're here to sell yourself. Isn't this all just a big PR stunt?" The accusation was a final swing, a bid to paint Musk as a self-serving showman. The audience stirred, some murmuring in agreement, but most waited for Musk's response, their loyalty already won. Was Colbert's attack a spark of redemption, or the last gasp of a defeated host? Musk's eyes locked onto Colbert's, his voice steady, but laced with contempt. "Sell myself, Stephen? I don't need a stage to do that. You, on the other hand, need this desk to feel relevant." The retort was a dagger slicing through Colbert's final defense. The crowd exploded, their cheers a deafening wave that shook the studio. Musk's words weren't just a counter. They were a public execution of Colbert's credibility, exposing the host's dependence on his platform for validation. Colbert's face burned, his hands gripping the desk as if to anchor himself against the tide. The host, now fully unmoored, let his anger erupt. "You're a hypocrite, Elon," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You talk about truth, but you dodge accountability every chance you get. You're no different from the rest of us." The outburst was raw, a primal scream of frustration that stunned the audience into silence. For a fleeting moment, Colbert's vulnerability humanized him, drawing sympathy from those who still clung to his side. But Musk was relentless, his response a quiet, devastating blow. "The difference, Stephen, is I don't hide behind a smile. You're not accountable to truth. You're accountable to your audience's applause." The crowd roared again, their approval a crushing verdict. Colbert's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Musk's words. The host tried to muster a response, but his voice faltered, the words dying in his throat. The audience, sensing his defeat, turned their cheers into a chant of Musk's name, a humiliating chorus that echoed through the studio. Musk rose from his seat, his presence towering over the broken host. "You wanted a fight, Stephen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of triumph. "I just didn't expect to lose." Colbert, unable to meet Musk's gaze, stared at the desk, his silence a confession of defeat. The producers, frantic, signaled for the show to end, but the audience's fervor drowned out their cues. Musk turned to the crowd, raising a hand in acknowledgement, and the cheers grew louder, a tidal wave of support that buried Colbert's legacy in its wake. The host, once the master of his domain, was now a footnote in his own story, outmaneuvered and exposed by a guest who refused to play by his rules. As the cameras prepared to cut, the studio was a maelstrom of emotion, triumph, shock, and the raw catharsis of a battle won. Musk's victory was not just personal, it was a statement, a rejection of the media's polished hypocrisy. The night had been a war, and the tech mogul had emerged not just unscathed but exalted. The final moments promised closure, a resolution that would seal this unforgettable clash. The studio was a whirlwind of sound and emotion as the final moments of the show unfolded. Stephen Colbert sat motionless at his desk, his face a portrait of defeat, the once vibrant host reduced to a shadow of his former self. Elon Musk stood tall, his silhouette commanding the stage, as the audience's chants of his name reverberated like a victory hymn. The crowd, electrified by the tech mogul's relentless dismantling of their host, was no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to a seismic shift, a moment where the rules of the game had been rewritten. The air crackled with the weight of what had transpired, and all eyes were on Musk as the night drew to its close. Colbert, his voice barely audible, tried to muster a final word. "Well, folks, that's all we have time for," he croaked, his usual charm replaced by a hollow resignation. The audience barely registered his words, their focus locked on Musk, who remained standing, his gaze sweeping the room. The host's attempt to wrap the show was a formality, a feeble gesture in the face of his public unraveling. The producers, sensing the futility, waved for the cameras to cut, but Musk wasn't done. He turned to the crowd, his voice clear and resolute. "This isn't about me," he said, pausing for effect. "It's about you. Don't let anyone tell you what to think. Question everything." The audience erupted, their applause a thunderous endorsement that drowned out any trace of Colbert's presence. The words were a rallying cry, a call to reject the polished narrative spun by men like the host. Musk's triumph was complete, not just a victory over Colbert, but a repudiation of the entire system he represented. The crowd rose to their feet, their cheers a testament to the power of unfiltered truth. Colbert, unable to bear the weight of the moment, dropped his head, his hands clasped tightly as if to shield himself from the reality of his defeat. Musk stepped forward, addressing the audience directly, his tone earnest but unyielding. "The world's changing, and it's not about desks or spotlights. It's about ideas, about building something real. Don't let anyone distract you from that." The words were a final blow, not to Colbert but to the media machine that had propped him up. The crowd's response was deafening, a wave of affirmation. That carried Musk's message beyond the studio walls. The host, once the arbiter of the conversation, was now irrelevant, his stage stolen by a man who refused to bow. As the cameras finally cut, the audience's ovation continued, a relentless tide that followed Musk as he exited the stage. Colbert remained seated, staring blankly at the desk, the echoes of the crowd's rejection ringing in his ears. Backstage, producers scrambled to spin the narrative, but the truth was undeniable. Musk had turned their carefully curated show into a platform for his own unapologetic vision. The host's humiliation was complete, his sanctimonious armor shattered, by a guest who had played the game better than he ever could. The studio lights dimmed, but the energy lingered, a testament to the night's transformative power. Musk's departure was not an exit, but a coronation, his silhouette etched in the minds of those who had witnessed his triumph. For the audience, it was a moment of catharsis, a reminder that authenticity could still cut through the noise. Colbert, left alone in the fading glow, was a cautionary tale, a man who had underestimated his opponent and paid the ultimate price. The show ended not with a whimper, but with a roar, a triumphant affirmation of Musk's defiance. The audience left the studio buzzing, their conversations alive with the thrill of what they'd seen. There was no cliffhanger, no lingering question, only the clarity of a battle won, a narrative reclaimed, and a stage forever changed. Musk had walked onto Colbert's turf and walked away a conqueror, leaving behind a host who would never again wield the same power.